Welcome to episode 61 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's December 31st, 1994. We're in North London at Highbury, Arsenal versus Queen Park Rangers. This is one of those matches that didn't need to be a classic to become immortal, because it produced a moment so improbable that fans turned it into folklore. Jensen scored. If you followed Arsenal in the mid-90s, that sentence lands like a punchline, because Jensen wasn't a goal scorer. He was a serious footballer, a functional footballer, a do-the-job midfielder. But goals? No. And that's exactly why this story matters. Not just because Jensen finally scored on New Year's Eve, but because football crowds have a special love for the worker who almost never gets a headline, until one day he does. Today on the pod, we'll tell the Jensen story, and then use it as a gateway drug into a global cross-era tradition, the cult of the unlikely goal scorer. Those who fans sing about, not because they score every week, but because they score once or twice, or in the one moment where it feels like the universe briefly bends. And we'll do it through a set of football folk legends, like John Jensen, Javier Mascherano, Tony Hibbert, Jimmy Glass, and perhaps a few you haven't heard about, like Santos' Iriarte or Friaça. Let's go. First, Jensen. The setting is simple. Arsenal are at home, and they're chasing points in the Premier League. QPR arrive and score early. Highbury goes tense. Then, in the second half, Arsenal get the equalizer, and the scorer is John Jensen. It's not just an equalizer, it's a release, because Jensen had played match after match after match without scoring, and the fan relationship had evolved into a ritual. Whenever he got near the box, the crowd would basically plead with him to shoot. Shoot, John, please, for the love of God, shoot. And then finally he does. He gets the ball on the edge of the penalty box, takes a step, and curls the ball in by the far post. For a single goal in the Premier League, it's a beauty. Arsenal fans celebrate because their player has done the impossible. But here's what makes this story even better. Arsenal don't even win the match. No, QPR go on to win 3-1. So the scoreboard doesn't give Jensen his, and that was the winner, cinematic ending. Instead, football does something more interesting. It gives Jensen myth. Because when a non-scorer scores, the goal becomes a collectible moment, proof that we witnessed something statistically rare, like a solar eclipse, but in boots. And that's where the chant is born, and the t-shirts and the culture. Quote, I was there when Jensen scored, end quote. And QPR fans, correctly sensing an opportunity for comedy, create the perfect reply. I was there when Jensen scored, and Gallen, and Allen, and Impey. Because yes, Jensen's goal was the miracle, but QPR still did the damage. That's football. Romance, mockery, and memory, all in the same 90 minutes. Now zoom out. Why do fans love these players? Because football isn't only about excellence, it's also about identification. The superstar goalscorer is admired, of course. The unlikely goalscorer is claimed. Fans see themselves in the man who runs, covers, tackles, plugs gaps, does the unglamorous work, and rarely gets the reward. So when that guy scores, it feels like the world briefly becomes fair. And across football history, you can build an entire museum of these moments. So let me give you a few that are pure concentrated folklore. First, Javier Mascherano at Barcelona. Mascherano is a warrior, a leader, a defensive specialist, and for years he played for Barça without scoring. Match after match, season after season, the same running joke. Will Mascherano ever score? Then, in 2017, Barcelona are cruising in a 7-1 win over Osasuna, and ahead 5-1 in the second half, they get a penalty. And this is the moment where football crowds reveal their true nature. They don't want the obvious scorer, they want the story. Mascherano's teammates like Ivan Rakitic, who usually takes penalties for Barca, push it. So does Lionel Messi, who already had scored 2. The crowd pushes it. The whole stadium essentially begs for it to happen. Okay, he says, and steps up, and converts. After 319 appearances, Mascherano finally has his Barca goal. And the celebration isn't just about a goal, it's about closure, like a long-running sitcom finally paying off, the punchline. Then we have Tony Hibbert at Everton. Hibbert wasn't a star. He was a loyal fullback, commitment, durability, and a career defined by defensive work. And crucially, he never scored in a competitive professional match. So Everton fans do what fans do. They turn it into culture. They literally unfurled a banner that reads, if Hibbert scores, we riot. It's half joke, half promise, and entirely football. Then Hibbert gets a testimonial. And in 2012, against AEK Athens, he scores a free kick. And Everton fans invaded the pitch. Not because it's a cup final, not because it wins a league, but because the cult moment finally happened. A man who never scored, scored. The crowd treated it like history. Now the purest form of this genre, Jimmy Glass. A goalkeeper on emergency loan. In 1999, Carlisle United need a win to stay in the Football League. Last minute, corner kick. The keeper comes up, the ultimate football act of desperation. And Jimmy Glass scores the winner. Of course he did. A goalkeeper scoring a relegation-saving last gasp goal is football operating at maximum narrative absurdity. It's so perfect it sounds fake, which is exactly why it became permanent. That goal doesn't just save Carlisle, it turns a working professional into a legend who will never pay for a drink in that town again. Now let's go to the biggest stage of them all, the World Cup. First, we have Santos Iriarte from Uruguay in 1930. He's the canary on the outside left. His career numbers are solid, but not superstar-like. But in the first World Cup final ever, the birth of the modern football myth, he scores the goal that flips the match. Uruguay versus Argentina, a comeback, tension, the first final in history trying to define what world champion even means. And Iriarte scores to make it 3-2 Uruguay. That's permanent cult status because he scored a foundational goal, a goal that embedded in the origin story of the sport's biggest tournament. So Iriarte becomes immortal, not as a rare scorer, but as a man who touched the sport's creation myth at the decisive moment. Now Friaça, in Brazil in 1950. Here's a cruel twist. Friaça's cult status is built on the goal that should have made him a national hero. He scores in the title-deciding match against Uruguay at the Maracanazo. Brazil take the lead right after halftime. The 200,000 in the stadium believes, the country believes. And then, the Maracanazo. Uruguay again flips the match around to win the World Cup title. Oh, we'll surely do an episode on this match come July. But back to Friaça, who becomes a different kind of remembered man. The one who opened the door to paradise before the whole nation walked into trauma. And here's the detail that makes it fit your unlikely goal scorer framework. At international level, that goal is essentially the Friaça goal. Today he is not remembered for the 114 goals he scored for Vasco da Gama. He's remembered for his one international goal, for symbolism, for being the scorer in the match that became the Maracanazo. Cult status through emotional gravity. And what about José Luis Brown, the Argentine defender who scored his only international goal in the 1986 World Cup final, when Germany's keeper, Toni Schumacher, misjudged the corner kick? Again, if you only score one goal in your career, the World Cup final is quite the place to do it. That's cult status. Late in the final, Brown then added immortality when he dislocated his shoulder only to refuse being substituted. Football supporters don't only worship talent, they worship sacrifice that is visible. Let's close out with a defender who scored that one goal that changed everything. European Cup history gives you this golden nugget. We're talking about Hans-Georg Schwarzenbeck, Katje Schwarzenbeck of Bayern München, a centre-back, a defender's defender. In April 1974, Bayern are seconds from losing the European Cup final to Atletico Madrid, and Katje hits a long-range equalizer in the last minute of extra time. Not Franz Beckenbauer, not Gerd Müller, no, the centre-back. His shot forces a replay, and Bayern go on to win it, their first of 3 consecutive European Cup titles. It's one of those goals where, for the rest of your life, your name doesn't need an introduction, because that goal is your introduction. So what's the real mechanism here? 3 takeaways, as always. 1. Scarcity creates value. A goal from a frequent scorer is expected. A goal from a non-scorer feels like a glitch in the universe, and fans treasure glitches. 2. Unlikely scorers feel owned by the crowd. These goals belong to the supporters in a way superstars' goals don't, because the supporters have been willing it into existence for years, with chants, jokes, banners, and pleading. And 3. The story outlives the result. Jensen scores, Arsenal lose, and we still talk about Jensen. Hibbert scores in a testimonial and becomes more famous than many competitive goals. Glass scores once and becomes an institution. Iriarte, Friaça, and Brown score in moments that define eras, and the names become shorthand for football's deepest emotional memories. Football is not just a sport, it's a story engine, and sometimes the story engine chooses the least likely character to write the most permanent line. That's all for episode 61 of OTD, the Jensen chant, and the cult of the unlikely goal scorer across football history. If you got your own "I was there when Jensen scored" folk hero, the guy your club still sings about because he did it once, email me at otd@17lawsguy.com. And please rate us 5 stars, subscribe, and tell a friend. Help the algorithm find us so we can climb the charts on Spotify, Apple, iHeart, or wherever you listen. Tomorrow on episode 62, we are staying with New Year football, but we're going back to wartime Edinburgh, January 1st, 1940, Hibernian versus Hearts, in a dense pea soup at Easter Road, a 6-5 derby that most people inside the ground couldn't properly see, and where the BBC commentator ends up essentially inventing the match on air, under instructions not to reveal the fog. It's one of the strangest broadcast stories football have ever produced. See you then. And as this is our last episode in 2025, I wish you all a safe transition to 2026, and I hope to see you in the new year.